my name is Sarah, and welcome to Discover Point Online. We are so glad you are able to connect with us today. We want you to be able to take your next step in your walk with Jesus, no matter what that looks like. As you watch, if you have any questions about today's message, our church, upcoming events, or maybe you have a prayer request, we invite you to send us a message through our website at discoverpointchurch.com/connect. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, here's the message.
We started a new series last week just simply entitled R12, and there's nothing magical about R12. I know that some of you are like, what does that even mean? It just simply means Romans chapter 12, okay? And so what we're talking about through the next couple months is living a transformed life. You come to Jesus, you understand what it means to come to Jesus, to have a relationship with Jesus, and then we ask ourselves the question, what's next? Like after you come to Jesus, after you place your faith and trust in Jesus, after you surrender your life to Jesus, what comes next? And so Paul uses and starts with Romans chapter 12 to talk about what that looks like. And so if you weren't here last week, or even if you were here last week, I want us to go back through chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, because these are really important verses when it comes to Romans chapter 12. And so this is what Paul says. And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all that he has done for you. If you remember last week, we talked about, I don't believe that Paul is necessarily talking about the physical body. I believe that he's talking about our everything. Everything that there is about us, our mind, our ears, our eyes, also our physical body, that we are to give them to God, not out of obligation, but because of all that he has done for us, because of his mercy and because of his grace. He goes on and it says, let them be a living and a holy sacrifice, the kind that he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. So before we go on to verse 2, I want to ask you a question, because last week what we did is we kind of defined worship as a lifestyle, as what we do 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, when people are watching us and when people are not watching us. And so I want to ask you a question this week. Is the worship that you gave to God through your lifestyle, was it something that he found acceptable this week? Now, I know that if you're not careful, you could look at your spouse, or you could look at your friend, or you look at your kids, and you could answer that question for them. But I'm not asking you to do that. I'm asking you to answer that question for yourself. Paul goes on in verse 2, and he says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way that you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. And so if you would today, I want you to ask yourself this question, and on your note sheet right there in front of you, I want you to answer this question, all right? On a scale from 1 to 10, if people close to you were to ask to evaluate you, what would their score be? Like if your spouse or your children or somebody that you work with, if they were asked to evaluate your life based on Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being, man, he or she's not getting it done, to all the way to 10, they're getting it done, right? What would that number be? Now, you probably ask yourself this question, Pastor, why does it matter what other people think about me? I'm glad you asked that, because that leads me to this point right here. We can't always trust other people's evaluation of us. Because I don't know if you're anything like me. I've been in church long enough, been in church since I was like 5 years old. I got saved and baptized at 11 years old. I felt like God was calling me into the ministry at 13 years old. I'm 45 years old now. Listen, I've been around church long enough to know how to act like a Christian, how to talk like a Christian, how to perform like a Christian. I can do it. And I know that several of you in here are pretty good at the acting and the performing, that you could also act really good where people's evaluation might be completely different than the reality and the truth. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about a subject that's very difficult in my life, and probably, if you were honest enough, to something that's difficult in your life, and that's this right here, humility. This is something that God has called all believers to live in. And it is difficult. Especially if you've been around church long enough time, you feel like you get to the place where you become the judge and the critique of everybody else that walks through the door. I've seen it before. I've been a lead pastor. This is my 20th year of being a lead pastor in a ministry, and I've seen it before. I've watched it before. I've heard it before. I've heard people say things like, I can't believe that she would wear that to church. I can't believe that he would watch those kind of TV shows. I can't believe this, or I can't believe that. And if we're not careful, we start judging people because we feel like we've made it to a place where we've arrived. And so let me give you a definition of humility, because I think it's extremely important. Humility is freedom from pride or arrogance. Some of the most prideful people I have ever met in my life are in the church. Some of the most prideful people that I've ever met in my life are not only active in the church, but you would look at their life and you would think that they are some of the most mature people in the faith, because of where they've been, because of how often they've been there, because of some good prayers that they've prayed, and you can fill in the rest of the blank. And so today, the verse that we're going to look at is going to be a very challenging verse for the majority of us. It's been very, very challenging to me, as Paul, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, goes from verses 1 to 2, and now he hits us with 3. Now, most people would include verse number 3 with verses 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, but I'm not going to do that, because I think that this verse needs to stand alone. And this is what it says. Because of the privilege and authority that God has given me, I give each of you this warning. Don't think that you are better than you really are. Be honest in your evaluation of yourselves, measuring yourselves by the faith God has given you. And so what I want to do today is I want us to talk about what it means to be honest with ourselves and evaluate where we really are. You probably came with someone today that you spend the majority of your time evaluating and critiquing where they are instead of really focusing on where you are. As parents, we're really good at that, right? I can pretty much tell you where I think or where I perceive my kids are in their life, but this is what my kids are good at because your kids are good at it, because we are good at it, and that's hiding. Hiding where we really are. Hiding the reality of where we really are in our lives. And what Paul says is, hey, I'm going to talk to you about living sacrifices, about offering yourself so that you can be acceptable to God, right? Now remember, I got to go back to this. Romans chapter 1 Romans chapter 1 through Romans chapter 11, Paul tells us how we are made right with God. We are not made right to God by our own actions. We are made right to God because of Jesus. But in chapter number 12, he says, now that you know Jesus, now that you're a follower of Jesus, this is what your life should look like. This is what it needs to be. So he tells us in verse number 1 and verse number 2. And then in verse number 3, he says, look, I want you to remember this. Don't think that you are better than you really are. Now, I know when we come to church, we like to be encouraged. We like to leave here thinking, man, I can charge, with my life. I can go full speed because I got this and I can do this. But Paul says, whoa, stop. You've got to think about this, and you've got to remember that you're not better than you think you are. And listen, this is what he says. Be honest in your evaluation of yourselves. That's hard to do. I don't know how many of you work with large corporations that you sit down with your boss and your boss kind of gives you a reality of where you are. Like, this is where you really are. This is where you think you are, but this is where I see that you really are. And I think a lot of us, we're scared to do that with God. We're scared to ask Him, show me where I really am so that I can get to where you want me to be. And so in Proverbs, it's a book that we call the book of wisdom. There's some verses that I want to just say. Pride leads to disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. Proverbs 16:18 says, pride goes before destruction and haughtiness before a fall. Listen to what James 4:6 says. But He gives more grace. Therefore, it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So when I think of all of my years in the church, and as I remember, and as I go back and I remember all the conversations that I've watched and that I've heard and that I've even had, as I watched how people live out their life, I can't help but go back to the Gospel of Luke and chapter 18 and verses 9 through 14. It is a story that Jesus tells, and this is such an important story in Scripture because this represents your life. One of these people in this story represents where you're at. If you're a follower of Jesus, it represents you. My question is which person represents you? So Jesus told this story to some who had great confidence in their own righteousness and scorned everyone else. Two men went to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee. In other words, he was a religious leader. And the other was a despised tax collector. These were the worst of the worst. Many people looked at them as equal to murderers or adulterers. They did not like tax collectors. And then the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed this prayer. I thank you, God, that I am not like other people. Cheaters, sinners, adulterers. I am certainly not like that tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give you 1/10 of my income. But the tax collector stood at a distance and dared not even lift his eyes to heaven as he prayed. Instead, He beat his chest in sorrow, saying, "O God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner." I tell you, this sinner, not the Pharisee, returned home justified before God. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. If we're not careful, we will spend a lot of our times when we talk about self-evaluation of evaluating ourselves based upon the comparison to other people. We're all really good at that. And usually when we talk about we need to self-evaluate or we need to evaluate where we really are, what we like to do is we like to choose people who we think do a worse job at life than we do. I don't know why it's that we don't choose other people, right? And so what I want to encourage you to do today is as we talk about self-evaluation, do not compare yourself with other people. Because this is what you do. Well, at least I'm not cheating like that person. At least I'm not an adulterer like that person. At least I'm not a criminal like this person. Instead of comparing yourselves with other people, start comparing yourself with a holy and a righteous God. Because when we do that, then we really recognize the reality of where we are. So on your note sheet, I want you to get this. Comparison is a dangerous way to evaluate yourselves or ourselves. It is extremely dangerous to just evaluate yourself based upon comparing with other people. And I don't know about you, but our culture, our society is extremely good at comparing. I mean, when I'm asked a question by someone, "Hey man, how are you really doing?" This is what I do. "Well, you know, I'm not where I want to be, but I'm so much further along than my buddy over here because I know that he ain't got it all together because he's been honest about where he is," right? He's not in denial that he's not where he really wants to be, but he's moving forward. A lot of times what I'll do is, you know, I'm not where I need to be, but I am further along. And so if we're not careful as believers, sometimes what we do is we have that puffed out chest. We have that arrogance. We have that pride about us. That we think we have all the answers. We think we do everything right. It's the other people that have something wrong with them. Quite often I talk about Celebrate Recovery. Celebrate Recovery is one of our freedom groups, one of our life groups that we do on Monday nights at 7 o'clock. And it's funny to me because sometimes, I should say it's sad to me, sometimes I stand up here and I talk about Celebrate Recovery and I watch people's reactions when I even mention Celebrate Recovery. And this is what most of the reactions I see looks like. Yep, that's for those people. Like Celebrate Recovery, I don't need Celebrate Recovery because I don't have any hurts in my life and I don't have any bad habits in my life. I don't have any hang-ups in my life. But other people have that, and so that's something that they need so much worse than I need. And so this is what I love about Celebrate Recovery. I come to Celebrate Recovery on Monday nights. I'm proud to come to Celebrate Recovery. I don't come to Celebrate Recovery because I pastor this church. I come to Celebrate Recovery because I'm a person who's had hurts in my life, have habits in my life that are not the best, and I just want to be honest. I want to have a place where I can just be honest with each other. And one thing that we've tried to do here at Discover Point Church is create a culture where you can just be you. You don't have to like fake it. In the church today, it's like we fake it until we make it. And that's not the best place to be. And so tomorrow night, I want to just throw this out there. Tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, we're going to start with a testimony. And this testimony is from a couple that attends our church, and it's a testimony of hope. If your marriage is at a place where you want it to be somewhere else, you want it to be better, I encourage you to come and hear this testimony. I know that you're scared to death because of that whole comparison thing. What will people think about me if I show up at Celebrate Recovery? People might think you don't have it all together. So they might think the truth about who we really are. So what I want to do is I want to share this verse that Paul shares to the church at Corinth. And he says this, "Oh, don't worry. We wouldn't dare say that we are as wonderful as these other men who tell you how important they are, but they are only comparing themselves with each other, using themselves as the standard of measurement. How ignorant." So true. So true. And so as we talk about self-evaluation today, I want to encourage you to be honest. I want to encourage you to really allow the Spirit of God to show you where you really are. There's a verse in the Psalms, Psalms 139, where King David says this, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me along the path of everlasting life." And so I'm going to ask you to do that today. There's 6 questions that I want to give you right now, and it's on your note sheet. And I want you, if you would, to spend time evaluating yourselves, being honest based upon where you really are, not where you want to be. Now, I know this might be difficult because you're sitting next to someone and you're like, I don't want these people to see. Don't cheat on your neighbor's paper, okay? Spouses, you might want to help your spouse be honest with their answer today, right? Because some of you, listen to me, some of you spend much more of your day telling them where they are other than evaluating where you really are. So on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being you're not doing it at all, and 10, it's hard to say 10, right? Because we're talking about humility. So if you put 10 down, you're probably dealing with pride, so you might want to bring that back a little bit, all right? So 6 questions to ask yourself when you are evaluating yourself. And listen, I don't want you to use this list just today. This is a great list to just look at weekly in your life. Number 1 is this. Am I spending time with God by reading the Word? Am I spending time with God by reading the Word? Now listen, I understand if you're not careful, you're going to compare, well, I'm not spending an hour reading my Bible like such and such. I didn't ask you to do that. Don't compare yourself with other people. Allow the Spirit of God to search you and show you where you are and evaluate where you are as far as spending time with God by reading the Word. Number 2, am I spending time with God by praying? Well, Pastor, I don't pray eloquent prayers. I didn't ask you what kind of prayers that you prayed. I didn't ask you if those words were very theological words, right? I didn't ask you any of that. I asked you, are you spending time talking with a God that's passionately in love with you? Number 3, is there any sin that needs to be dealt with? I can go ahead and tell you the answer is yes for all of us, because the Bible says we're all sinners. And I understand, again, in that whole comparison trap, there's a lot of us that we look at our sin and we go, well, my sin's not nearly as bad as such and such a sin. I mean, I only sped to church this morning going 15 miles above the speed limit, but I saw somebody come in 2 wheels. They had to have been going about 20 miles. Okay, it's so easy to minimize. See, some of y'all are laughing because you're like, was he watching me come in the parking lot? Man, this parking lot out here is nuts. Like, I am shocked we haven't buried somebody, literally, from church service, because people will come through here 40 miles an hour like Arby's has good food. You know, I haven't figured that out yet, right? If you work at Arby's, I apologize. I didn't mean to offend you. But I haven't had a beef and cheddar in probably 20 years, okay? Some of you are like, yeah, Pastor, you had one last night, I can tell. I didn't, all right? But the question is do we have sin in our life that we need to deal with? This is the problem with many of us. We see other sins from other people, but we won't look at our own. Jesus had a lot to say about that, right? Don't judge that person. Why are you looking at your neighbor that has a small speck in their eye when you have a log in your own eye? The third thing is this. Is there any sin that needs to be dealt with? Number 4, am I doing life with other believers? On a scale from 1 to 10, 1 would be you're isolated, you're doing your own thing, you're the Rambo Christian, right? You're just doing life and you're trying to survive, right? 10, or let's just say 8 and 9, right? You're doing life, you're being authentic, you're being real, you're doing life with other people, you're there for them every opportunity that you have. Number 5, am I being honest in my dealings with others? Am I being honest in my dealings with others? Let me bring it to you like this. It's tax season. When you filled out, some of y'all are like, whoa, Pastor. You just filled out your taxes. Did you cheat? If you cheated, that would be a 1 probably. Well, you say, Pastor, you mean other people, right? Not like the government. No, listen, it's the same thing. It talks about your character, right? We all have struggles with our character already, but are we being honest in our dealings with other people? Number 6, am I making other disciples? Now, I know some of you are going, Pastor, like that doesn't fit the first 5. Well, let me just say this. This is our mission as Christ followers, to make other disciples. The last question, it's not on your sheet of paper, but I want to ask you a yes or no question. Did you lie about any of the evaluations between number 1 and number 6? A lot of us love to minimize. We love to sit back and go, I feel like I have it all together. I feel like I'm doing good. And what's true is you might be doing so much better than you ever have. And so we applaud that. I am grateful that you are where you're at today. But let's evaluate. Let's ask God to search us and try us and see if there's anything in our life that offends Him so that He can change that in our life.
We hope this message connected with you today. If so, we want to help you take a next step by answering any questions you may have or by praying for you today. Let us know how we can help by sending us a message through our website at discoverpointchurch.com/connect. If you would like to help support the ministry of Discover Point, you can give online at discoverpointchurch.com/give. Be sure to stay connected with us through social media to stay up to date with everything going on here at Discover Point. We hope you have a great day.